All right, so tunneling the interwebs, or do you even port forward? So that's me. You can follow me on G+. I generally don't post personal stuff on there, just like videos of science or web development stuff. So SSH Tunnels, I've noticed there's one of the problems with it when I was researching it and how it works, especially as far as remote tunneling goes. A lot of the blogs and stuff that I was reading, not very many people who were supposedly teaching it on their blog posts really understood the concepts. And I didn't realize this, of course, until after I finally fully grasped how some of those things work. So hopefully, the point of this talk would be to kind of clear up some of these misconceptions and help you guys fully understand what it is. So what is it? In a nutshell, basically, an SSH tunnel is just an encapsulation of basically any internet protocol that you'd want to either add in a layer of an encryption to it so that you have some privacy. Not all protocols obviously are encrypted, FTP or just plain HTTP, for instance. So you may just be interested in the security aspect of that or the privacy aspect of that. Other reasons you may want to do that is you may be trying to access a server of yours that you have behind a firewall, or trying to get out of a server that's firewalled. So if we use an analogy with Mario Brothers here, if you think, for instance, that Mario is basically your private data that you want to transmit, or whatever it is you're trying to do through the tunnel, and his little warp pipes there are the SSH tunnel. So while in the world of Mario, it's kind of a shortcut for him, but in our analogy here, we're going to think of it as you can't really see how he gets from point A to point B. You just know that he goes in one end of the tube and comes out the other. You don't really see what's going on inside. So some reasons, like I said, you may want to tunnel is basically for the privacy factor of that. You may be transmitting personal data to somebody else on another server, or you may just be trying to download some personal files that you have on a remote server somewhere. And again, the aspect of a firewall, you can have a firewall that's completely, no holes or anything through that. If you have at least SSH access, you'll be able to open up, through that tunnel, a way of accessing a local server on there, like an FTP or HTTP, for instance. So you have three different types. There's local, remote, and dynamic. So I'll go over each one in turn. So with a local tunnel, basically what that means is you're initiating the tunnel from your local computer, and the port that is going to be forwarded starts at that local computer, and the endpoint is at the remote computer. So that particular thing is one of the confusion points I notice a lot of people have is what exactly does it mean when you say local? It's not talking about necessarily where the connection is originating, but where, after you make the tunnel, where do you connect to access that tunnel? So to access a local tunnel, it is from where you initiated the connection. So here's the option you're going to use with the SSH. So -big L, and bind address is optional, of course. And this is literally a string. It's not, different options. So you have to separate that string out with the colons here. Now, bind address, the reason why you would want to use that is if you want to open up that tunnel, say to your local network or maybe to the world. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but the option is there. By default, if you leave that off, that's going to only be available locally. So you have to have, so to speak, physical SSH or whatever access to that server where it was created. And then obviously if you bind it to, a network address within that network, anybody else on that network that can address that machine could also use that. So the second part of that is the port. So in the case of local port forwards, the port there is referencing what port you're going to connect to from that server to access that tunnel. And then here in this instance, host means from your reference point here, host is going to be the remote server where the endpoint of the tunnel is going to be, and then the host port. So for example, if Mario is on his machine at Underworld, he's going to do SSH minus big L. So his local port that he's going to create is port 8080. And just real quick, one thing that I left out is the port can be anything you want it to be. Doesn't matter what it is. Obviously, ports 1 through 1024, you have to have root access to, bind to those ports. But anything over 1024, you can, up to, 65535, you can bind any port number you want. So it's kind of irrelevant, really. And then localhost, so in this instance, localhost is talking about that remote server, which is here, Peach at another castle. So localhost is referencing another castle. And then again, port 80 here is referencing another castle. So in short, what this command means is I want to connect from underworld on port 8080, and where I want to end up is another castle's port 80. So in this example, this is obviously HTTP connection that we're talking about. So as Mario, after I've initiated this command, I can SSH, or excuse me, not SSH, I can open up my web browser and type localhost :8080, and what I will end up at is another castle, port 80. So just to kind of illustrate another point here too, I added the next line. When you execute that SSH command, you actually are logging in to that server as Peach at another castle. So your command prompt here, you're now on Peach. You'd have to open another window or another terminal or something like that if you want to do other things as Mario back on Underworld. So that tunnel will last for as long as you have that SSH connection open. If you happen to exit out of that, your tunnel also will be closed. So I can give kind of an example here. Just a quick demonstration. It's kind of small. I take it you don't have the zoom functionality enabled on here?
Do you just have like screenshots already in your slides?
Well, I can just go with.
Just increase the font?
Oops. Sorry. What is on Mac? How do I undo the?
Command plus.
No, I just want to get out of the full screen thing that I did.
Command shift F.
Yeah, I mean you can probably just.
Yeah, I tried hitting escape. Oh, there we go.
We'll just
All right, so I'll just skip the demonstration. But you guys, if you want, feel free to follow along on your laptops or whatever. I'm sure everyone here has a SSH or a remote server that they can play around with, I assume. So anyway, this diagram probably looks familiar. You saw it in another talk. Basically, it's just a standard HTTP connection. There's no encryption going on here. But so what would happen, on a regular connection is here is your local host. This is where you're initiating a connection from. On Underworld, you're just connecting directly to another castle on port 80. So plain text. There's nothing special going on there. Now, when you add that SSH tunnel and do it through that, as you can see, it encapsulates that connection through that tunnel. So what would have been, plain text is now wrapped in your SSH encryption. So on localhost, you're going to connect to 8080. It's going to route you through your SSH tunnel, and you're going to end up there on port 80. So by itself, there's not really very much reason to do that unless just for whatever reason that HTTP server didn't have SSL and you needed some information on it that you didn't want transferred in plain text. But a more compelling reason to use it would be that that HTTP server might be behind a firewall. So in this case, with that firewall there, you wouldn't be able to access port 80 on that computer just by directly addressing it. So as long as you have SSH access, you can then tunnel through that firewall and get to that HTTP server. So a remote SSH tunnel would be where they call it remote because, and this is the part that makes it a little bit confusing, is because you initiate it from the remote end, or in other words, the end you're trying to access. the difference there is that you're still, when you go to use the tunnel, you're still going the same direction to use it. So you're going from Underworld to another castle, but it was initiated from another castle back to Underworld. So a good way to think of it is it's like a reverse tunnel. So here's the option you give, -R, again, bind address is completely optional. And then port, in this case, you have to think about it backwards because you're now on another castle. You have to think this is the port I want bound on the destination, which is Underworld. And then host and host port in this example still means another castle. So it's still the server that your tunnel's endpoint will be. So it can be a little bit confusing in that, but I'll show, or we'll go into a little bit more detail. So again, it's the same command. You're just swapping out the L for an R. And again, that's one of the things that can make it a little bit confusing because this localhost 80 has the exact same meaning as it did before. You're still talking about another castle. So 8080 here is in reference to Underworld. Localhost 80 is in reference to another castle. So you can see it's kind of reversed from before in that you initiate the connection for the tunnel here, and you end up here. But then when you use the tunnel, you're still from Underworld. You're still going to open up your browser and go to localhost 8080, and that's still going to end up being that page on another castle. So why would you want to be able to do that? Well, for a number of reasons. Say, for instance, on another castle here where you're initiating that connection, maybe you don't have SSH access to that from the outside. So what you would want to do is when you're physically there or in a situation where you actually can log into it, that's when you're going to create your tunnel. And then when you're back home or wherever Underworld is, then you now have access on port 8080 to get to that HTTP server. So it allows you to be able to set up a tunnel from the opposite end when you don't have SSH access from the outside. So again, it's still, if that scary firewall is still blocking your connection, it's still giving you a pathway to get there without having to directly access it. Any questions on that part? Okay, so a dynamic tunnel is a little bit more interesting. Basically, a dynamic tunnel is, for all intents and purposes, is a SOCKS 5 server.
Is it what?
SOCKS 5, a proxy server. So what it is when you set up a dynamic is, the command here is obviously a lot more simplified. All you really need to specify is a port number. And what that does is whichever point you're running this command from, whether it be like on Underworld or on another castle, that port number for that machine will then be a proxy server to whatever remote server you're connecting on. So in this example then, if we're Peach at another castle and we do SSH minus big D 1080 to Mario at Underworld, what we're saying is create a tunnel from another castle to Underworld, and because it's dynamic, it doesn't point specifically to anything on Mario's Underworld. So on Underworld, what's going to happen is every connection to another castle on 1080, when it gets over to Underworld, Mario's computer there is going to figure out what that is. Say it's google.com, it'll go get the information, pull it back, and send it back to another castle. So just like any other proxy server. So, of course, as an example here, I know we all use Internet Explorer, right? So if say you're behind some firewall here where you can't necessarily get in or out, maybe like a corporate firewall that blocks you from getting to YouTube or something like that. So what that would do is when you run that command, you now have localhost 1080. You just set up Internet Explorer or Chrome, obviously, to use SOCKS 5 proxy, and the address you give it is localhost 1080. Now, every page that you open up, rather than try to directly go to that site, it's going to hit localhost 1080, forward that connection to Underworld. Underworld's going to go out to the interwebs here, get whatever it is you were asking for, send it right back across that tunnel to you. So basically, encapsulating that through there so you can get to sites that you may not be able to access from inside that network. Say they have NAT or something like that, or just some kind of weird proxy rules that block whatever site you're trying to get to. But then also with the added benefit that it's basically like SSL everywhere. One point to keep in mind, however, is that this connection from Underworld to the internet is not encrypted unless, of course, it's already SSL. So your encryption is only going to be from these 2 points. And then, whatever happens from here to here, you obviously have no control over that. So a couple of advanced things that you can do with this is, one thing I didn't mention, just to keep it simple, is that the host here doesn't actually have to be localhost. So this computer, so on Underworld here, I'm now connecting to Airship. As long as Airship can address another castle, then that tunnel will actually be forwarded to that machine. So you're basically using Airship just as a hop. So in this example here, we're using port 2222. That's the port that'll be opened up on Underworld here because it's a local. So what's going to happen is with SSH, you're going to log into Airship. Airship's going to open up another connection to another castle on their port 22. And then what happens here on this, well, let's just say I was going to demo this, but if this line were Mario at Underworld, if you SSH to localhost, which is Underworld, on port 2222, you're going to end up in another castle. But that went through the Airship computer. So basically, what that could be in this analogy is Airship could be, a server that you have, that you have SSH access to from the outside, whereas another castle might be behind a different firewall that it's not addressable from the outside, but is addressable from Airship. So basically, say you have a home network where you have, your router or something like that, and then you have various other computers that are connected from there, and you want to be able to SSH into your home computer. Your home computer may not necessarily have port 22 open to the world, but you may have something set up on your router that you can SSH in directly there, and then have it tunnel it to your home computer. Oh, so yeah, this is what I was talking about. So here on Underworld, if you were to SSH to localhost, and of course you have to use the same username of whatever that remote computer is to port 2222, you're going to see that you're logged in to another castle, not to Airship, even though that tunnel was made through Airship.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Any questions about that? All right. So you can kind of nest, so to speak, these SSH tunnels together because, as many of you I'm sure know, on SSH, after whatever options you specify, you can initiate a command on a remote server. So you can actually initiate that as another SSH tunnel and then another SSH tunnel. So say you know that you have 4 different hops before you get where you need to go, you can actually just do that all in one command rather than SSH to one, setting up that tunnel, and then from there SSH to the next one with another tunnel, and then so on. You can just do all of those commands all in one line. So an important thing to point out here is this first SSH command, you're logging into host 1, and then host 1 is doing the SSH tunnel to host 2. Host 2 is then doing the SSH tunnel to host 3. So the point to take note of here is when you're logging in, because host 1 was the first one, that's what you're going to be logged into once you've done authenticating, and then whatever you want to do from there. So the different options, L, R, and D, can all be done at the same time. So you can set up a local port forward to one computer while at the same time setting up a remote port forward to a third computer, and then opening up a dynamic port forward from here to there as well. So as many as you want. You can open up, several different locals or several different remotes all at once. It's very flexible. So that's pretty much it. It's I know it takes a little bit to understand. I was hoping to do some more demonstrations so I could show more of like how that works. But if you have any questions, definitely come and ask me, and I can, if you want, sit down together and we can go through it or whatever. So that's it.